They were going to launch bombers that were never designed to take off from aircraft carriers. April 18th, 1942, 8 a.m. The USS Hornet is pitching in heavy seas 650 miles off the coast of Japan. On the carrier's deck are 16 B-25 Mitchell bombers. These are medium-range Army bombers. They weigh 15 tons each fully loaded. They need at least 1,000 feet of runway to take off safely. The Hornet's deck is 800 feet long, and the first 450 feet are blocked by the planes behind, so the lead bomber has about 350 feet of deck space. That's not enough. Not even close. The bomber will either make it into the air, or it'll slide off the deck into the ocean, and everyone on board will die. Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle is in the lead plane. He's 45 years old. He's a legendary pilot. He holds the world speed record. He's done things with aircraft that people thought were impossible. And right now, he's about to try something that might actually be impossible. Launch a fully loaded bomber off an aircraft carrier in the middle of a storm. Bomb Tokyo, then fly to China and hope he doesn't run out of fuel before he gets there. And he's not alone. 79 other men are in those 16 bombers, all volunteers, all knowing this is probably a one-way trip. This is the Doolittle Raid, 4 months after Pearl Harbor, when Americans needed hope, when the military needed a win, when everyone said it couldn't be done. They did it anyway. And what happened after they dropped their bombs changed the war, cost thousands of Chinese lives, and became the most famous suicide mission that somehow most people survived. Let's rewind to December 7th, 1941. Pearl Harbor, the Japanese surprise attack that brought America into World War II. Over 2,400 Americans killed. 8 battleships sunk or damaged. The Pacific Fleet crippled. It was the worst military disaster in American history. And the country was in shock. How could this happen? How did the Japanese attack American territory with total surprise? Where was the intelligence? Where was the defense? But the shock quickly turned to rage. Americans wanted revenge. They wanted to hit back. They wanted the Japanese to feel what Pearl Harbor felt like. The problem was the Japanese were winning everywhere. They'd taken the Philippines. They'd taken Wake Island. They'd taken Guam. They were advancing through Southeast Asia. The American military was in retreat. The Navy was rebuilding. The Army wasn't ready for major operations. There was no way to strike back at Japan. Not yet. But the pressure to do something, anything, was enormous. President Roosevelt was getting that pressure from all sides. The press wanted action. The public wanted revenge. Military commanders wanted to show the Japanese that America wasn't defeated. Roosevelt told his military advisors he wanted to bomb Tokyo. He wanted to hit the Japanese homeland, make them understand they weren't safe, that their surprise attack on Pearl Harbor would be answered. But how? Tokyo was thousands of miles from any American base. American bombers didn't have the range to reach Japan and return. Aircraft carriers could get close, but carrier-based planes were too small to carry meaningful bomb loads. It seemed impossible. Then someone had an idea. Captain Francis Lowe, an officer on Admiral Ernest King's staff, was inspecting the aircraft carrier USS Hornet in Norfolk, Virginia. He was watching planes take off and land. And he had a thought. What if you put Army bombers on a carrier? Not carrier-based planes. Actual medium bombers. The kind that take off from runways. Could you launch them from a carrier deck? They'd be too big to land back on the carrier. But maybe you could launch them, send them to bomb Japan, then have them fly to China and land there. China was fighting Japan. The Chinese would help American crews get back home. It was crazy, but maybe it could work. Lowe took the idea to Admiral King. King liked it. He brought it to General Hap Arnold, head of the Army Air Forces. Arnold loved it. Finally, a way to hit Japan, a way to answer Pearl Harbor. It didn't matter that it had never been done before. It didn't matter that people said it was impossible. They were going to try anyway, because doing something impossible was better than doing nothing. The plan came together quickly. They'd use B-25 Mitchell bombers. The B-25 was a good aircraft. Twin engine. Could carry 2,000 pounds of bombs. Reliable. But it wasn't designed for carrier operations, not even close. The B-25 needed 1,000 feet to take off with a full load. The Hornet's deck was only 800 feet, and you couldn't use the full deck because you had to park the other planes behind the lead plane. So the lead plane would have maybe 400 feet, maybe less. That wasn't enough runway. The plane would need to go from 0 to takeoff speed in that distance, with a full bomb load. In whatever weather conditions existed. It seemed impossible, but they'd try anyway. They needed a leader. Someone who could train crews to do this. Someone with the skill and reputation to make people believe it could work. Arnold chose Lieutenant Colonel James Doolittle. Doolittle was a legend. He'd been flying since World War I. He'd won air races, set speed records. He'd been the first to fly coast to coast in under 24 hours. He'd pioneered instrument flying. He'd proven you could fly through clouds without seeing the ground. He'd done aerobatic demonstrations that made people think planes could defy physics. If anyone could pull off an impossible mission, it was Doolittle. Arnold called Doolittle to Washington and told him the plan. Launch Army bombers off a carrier. Bomb Tokyo. Fly to China. Doolittle's response was immediate. He was in. It was dangerous. It was probably a one-way mission. But it was exactly the kind of challenge Doolittle lived for. Arnold made him the commander and told him to start training. January 1942. Doolittle started recruiting crews. He needed volunteers for a mission he couldn't fully explain. He went to air bases and asked for experienced B-25 crews. He told them it was dangerous. He told them it was voluntary. He told them they might not come back. He didn't tell them where they were going or what they'd be doing, just that it was important and risky. Plenty of men volunteered anyway. Everyone wanted to hit back at Japan. Everyone wanted to be part of something that mattered. Doolittle picked his crews carefully. Experienced pilots, good navigators, reliable gunners. He chose 24 crews, planning to use 16 for the actual mission. The extras were backups in case anyone dropped out or got injured during training. The training was intense and secretive. They practiced at a remote airfield in Florida. They painted a carrier deck outline on the runway, the exact length the planes would have on the Hornet. About 400 feet. Then they practiced taking off from that mark. Over and over, taking off with less runway than they'd ever used before. Taking off with full bomb loads. Taking off in crosswinds. Taking off until it became almost routine. Except it never really became routine, because every takeoff was dangerous. One mistake, one moment of hesitation, and the plane wouldn't get airborne. It would roll off the end of the runway. In training, that meant crashing into grass. On the carrier, it meant crashing into the ocean. The crews didn't know where they were going. Doolittle and his inner circle knew, but nobody else. The crews speculated endlessly. Some thought they'd bomb targets in the Philippines. Others thought maybe they'd hit Japanese bases in the Pacific Islands. A few guessed they might be going to Japan, but that seemed too crazy. How would they get there? How would they get back? While the crews trained, engineers modified the B-25s for the mission. They stripped out everything non-essential to reduce weight. They installed extra fuel tanks to extend range. They removed the lower gun turret and replaced it with a broomstick painted black to look like a gun from a distance. They fitted special quick-release bomb racks. Every modification was about giving the planes maximum range because they'd need every gallon of fuel to reach China after bombing Japan. March 1942. Doolittle announced the mission. They were going to bomb Tokyo. The crews were stunned. Tokyo? The Japanese capital? How? Doolittle explained. They'd launch from an aircraft carrier, the USS Hornet. They'd take off 400 to 500 miles from Japan, fly to Tokyo and other cities, drop their bombs, then continue west to China, land at friendly airfields, get help from the Chinese to return home. The whole thing depended on timing and fuel. They had just barely enough fuel to make it. If anything went wrong, if winds were against them, if they got lost, they'd run out of gas and crash. But they'd still do it, because hitting Tokyo was worth the risk. The crews had one last chance to back out. Anyone who wanted to withdraw could do so with no shame. Nobody withdrew. All 80 men were committed. They knew they might die, but they were going anyway. This was bigger than any individual. This was about showing Japan and the world that America could fight back. April 2nd, 1942. The 16 B-25s were loaded onto the USS Hornet in San Francisco. It was a tight fit. The bombers took up the entire deck. They were lined up nose to tail with no room to spare. Once they were loaded, no other planes could take off or land. The Hornet was basically just a floating runway now. The ship left port and headed west toward Japan. The crews lived in cramped quarters below deck. They couldn't practice flying because the planes couldn't take off until the mission. They could only sit and think about what was coming. April 18th approached. The plan was to launch at dusk on April 19th, get to Tokyo at night, bomb under cover of darkness, then fly to China and land at dawn when they could see the airfields. But plans change. April 18th, 1942. Early morning. The Hornet and its escort ships are about 650 miles from Japan. They're supposed to be here undetected. The Japanese shouldn't know an American carrier task force is this close to their homeland. But at 7:30 a.m. lookouts spot something. A Japanese patrol boat. It's small, just a fishing boat converted for patrol duty. But it has a radio, and it spotted the American ships. The American destroyers open fire and sink the patrol boat within minutes. But it's too late. The boat got a radio message off before it sank. The Japanese know American ships are nearby. They'll send aircraft to search. They'll send submarines. The element of surprise is gone, and the American ships are still 650 miles from Japan. That's 200 miles farther than planned. The bombers might not have enough fuel to reach China from this distance. Admiral Halsey, commanding the task force, makes a decision. Launch now! Launch immediately. It's 8 a.m. instead of dusk. The crews will bomb Tokyo in daylight instead of darkness. They'll have farther to fly to China. Their chances of making it are much worse. But if they don't launch now, Japanese aircraft might find the carriers and sink them. Doolittle and his crews have one choice. Go now or abort the entire mission. Doolittle doesn't hesitate. They go. The crews scramble to their planes. Engines start. The sea is rough. The Hornet is pitching in heavy waves. The deck is rising and falling 15 feet. Launching in these conditions is incredibly dangerous, but they're doing it anyway. The carriers turn into the wind to give the planes maximum lift. The crews wait for the signal. Doolittle is in the lead plane. He has the hardest job. He has the shortest runway because all 15 other planes are behind him. He has to take off first and prove it can be done. If he fails, if his plane slides off the deck into the ocean, the mission is over. The other crews won't take off. They'll turn back. Everything depends on Doolittle making this impossible takeoff work. The deck crew signals. Green flag. Go. Doolittle releases the brakes and pushes the throttles forward. The engines roar. The plane starts rolling. It picks up speed. The deck is rushing past. The front wheels lift. The plane is rotating. But the deck is ending. The bow is right there. The ocean is beyond it. The plane leaves the deck. For a heart-stopping moment, it drops. The nose drops toward the water. Everyone watching thinks it's going to crash. Then the plane catches air. The engines pull. The nose comes up. Doolittle is airborne. Barely, but airborne. He did it. The impossible takeoff worked. The other crews see this, and now they know it's possible. One by one, the other B-25s launch. Some takeoffs are smooth, some are terrifying. Every plane makes it. All 16 bombers get airborne. They form up and head toward Japan. The crews are committed now. They're going to bomb Tokyo or die trying. The flight toward Japan takes about 4 hours. The crews fly low over the water to avoid detection. They're nervous, excited, scared. This is what they trained for. This is their chance to strike back. But they also know the risks. If Japanese fighters intercept them, they're probably dead. The B-25 isn't a fighter. It's a bomber. It can defend itself, but not against swarms of Zeros. And if they can't make it to China, if they run out of fuel over the ocean or over Japanese-held territory, they're dead or captured. There's no rescue plan. If they go down, they're on their own. Around noon, they reach the Japanese coast. There's cloud cover. That's good. It gives them some concealment. They split up to hit different targets. Tokyo, Yokohama, Nagoya, Kobe, Osaka, different cities, different targets. The plan is to bomb military and industrial facilities. Factories, shipyards, oil refineries, targets that hurt the Japanese war effort. Doolittle's plane is heading for Tokyo. As they approach, they drop down to 1,500 feet. Low enough to see targets clearly, but high enough to avoid most ground fire. The crew is tense. They're about to bomb the enemy capital. They're about to do what everyone said was impossible. They can see the city, buildings, streets, people going about their day with no idea American bombers are incoming. The Japanese think they're safe. Their homeland has never been attacked. American planes don't have the range to reach Japan. Except here they are. The bombardier calls out, "Target ahead!" Doolittle steadies the plane. They're making their bombing run. The bomb bay doors open. The bombardier releases the bombs. 4 500-pound bombs drop away. The plane lurches upward as the weight comes off. The crew watches the bombs fall. They hit. Explosions. Smoke rising. They did it. They bombed Tokyo. The first American attack on the Japanese homeland. 4 months after Pearl Harbor. The psychological impact is enormous. The Japanese thought they were invincible. Now they know they're vulnerable. But there's no time to celebrate. They need to get out of Japanese airspace. They need to get to China before they run out of fuel. They turn west and climb. Behind them, Tokyo is reacting. Air raid sirens, fighters scrambling, anti-aircraft guns opening fire. The other American bombers are hitting their targets across Japan. All 16 planes drop their bombs. Some hit military targets, some hit factories. The physical damage is minimal. A few buildings destroyed, a handful of Japanese killed, but the psychological damage is massive. Japan has been attacked. Their homeland isn't safe. Their leaders lied when they said American bombers couldn't reach them. The 16 B-25s head west toward China. The crews are relieved. They did it. They bombed Japan and they're still alive. But now comes the hard part. Making it to China. They have fuel for maybe 1,300 to 1,400 miles. They're currently about 600 miles from the Chinese coast. That should be enough. Except the headwinds are strong. They're burning fuel faster than expected. And it's getting dark. They were supposed to bomb at night and reach China at dawn. Instead, they bombed in daylight and they're going to reach China at night. In a storm. With no way to contact the Chinese airfields. With no navigation aids. Just dead reckoning and hope. The hours pass. Fuel gauges drop. The sun sets. They're flying over the ocean in darkness. Some crews spot the Chinese coast. Others aren't sure where they are. All of them are running low on fuel. The plan was to land at Chinese airfields. But they can't see the airfields in the dark. And the Chinese don't know they're coming because the radios don't have enough range to warn them. The airfields are blacked out. No lights. No way to find them. The bombers are running out of fuel over hostile territory with no place to land. This is the moment the crews feared. They survived the takeoff. They survived bombing Japan. And now they're going to crash because they can't find a place to land. Doolittle makes a decision. He tells his crew to bail out, jump, use their parachutes, hope they land somewhere safe. The crew protests. Doolittle is the commander. He should jump first. But Doolittle refuses. He's going down with the plane. He'll jump last after everyone else is out. The crew finally agrees. One by one they jump into the darkness. Parachutes opening. Men falling through the night with no idea where they'll land. Doolittle is alone in the plane. Fuel is almost gone. He sets the autopilot. Then he jumps. The plane continues flying until it runs out of gas. Then it crashes somewhere in China. Doolittle falls through darkness. His parachute opens. He's alive, but he has no idea where he is or what's going to happen next. Doolittle lands in a rice paddy somewhere in China. It's pitch black. Raining. He can't see anything. He's bruised from the landing, but nothing's broken. He gathers his parachute and starts walking. He has no idea where his crew is. No idea if they survived. No idea if he's in Japanese-controlled territory or friendly Chinese territory. He's completely alone in enemy territory in the middle of the night, and he's convinced he's failed. The mission was supposed to end with all planes landing safely in China. Instead, everyone bailed out. All 16 planes crashed. Doolittle thinks he's going to be court-martialed for losing 16 aircraft and possibly getting his crews killed. He doesn't know yet that he's about to become a national hero. He doesn't know that what seems like failure is actually the beginning of something that will change the entire war. Let's talk about what's happening with the other crews. All 16 planes ran out of fuel over China. Some crews bailed out like Doolittle's. Others attempted crash landings in the dark. One plane made it to Soviet territory and landed there, but the Soviets interned the crew because they weren't at war with Japan yet. The other 15 crews were scattered across eastern China and some Japanese-occupied areas. 80 men jumping out of planes or crash landing in the dark with no coordination and no rescue plan. It's chaos. But here's what nobody expected. The Chinese people, the civilians in the areas where the Americans landed, they helped. Farmers who saw parachutes coming down went looking for the American airmen. Villagers who found crashed planes helped wounded crew members. Chinese resistance fighters guided Americans to safety. The Chinese risked their lives to protect these strangers, because they knew the Americans had just bombed Japan. The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The Chinese had been fighting Japan since 1937. They'd suffered terribly. Japanese forces had committed atrocities across China. So when American bombers attacked Japan, the Chinese celebrated. And when American airmen fell from the sky needing help, the Chinese helped them. Doolittle wandered for hours in the dark before he found a Chinese farmhouse. The family inside didn't speak English. Doolittle didn't speak Chinese. But they figured it out through gestures and drawings. The family hid Doolittle. They fed him. They sent word to Chinese resistance contacts. Within a day, resistance fighters found Doolittle and started guiding him to safety. The same thing was happening with other crews across the region. Chinese civilians and resistance fighters were locating American airmen and helping them evade Japanese patrols. But not everyone was lucky. One bomber, crew number 6, had engine trouble. They couldn't make it to China. They flew north toward Soviet territory and made an emergency landing near Vladivostok. The Soviets took them into custody. The crew expected to be sent home. America and the Soviet Union were allies after all. But the Soviets had a neutrality pact with Japan. They weren't supposed to help American forces attack Japan, so the Soviets interned Doolittle's crew 6 for over a year. They weren't prisoners exactly. They were detained guests. The treatment was decent, but they couldn't leave. It wasn't until 1943 that they managed to escape with Soviet help across the border into Iran. The whole thing was staged so the Soviets could claim the Americans escaped, rather than admitting they released them. The real tragedy happened with crew number 6. Wait, that's the crew that went to the Soviet Union. Let me correct that. The real tragedy happened with 2 crews that landed in Japanese-occupied territory. Crews 6, different numbering than the Soviet crew, and 16. These 8 men were captured by Japanese forces. They were taken prisoner, and their fate would become one of the darkest chapters of the Doolittle Raid. The 8 captured men were Lieutenant Dean Hallmark, Lieutenant William Farrow, Lieutenant Robert Height, Lieutenant George Barr, and Sergeant Harold Spatz, Corporal Jacob DeShazer, Private First Class Chase Nielsen, and Corporal Robert Mader. They were taken to Shanghai and imprisoned. The Japanese were furious about the raid. Their capital had been bombed. Their people had been killed. Their sense of invincibility had been shattered. Someone had to pay for this humiliation. The Japanese decided to try the captured airmen as war criminals. They accused them of bombing civilian targets and killing innocent people. Which was partially true. Some bombs did hit residential areas, but that happens in war. The distinction between military and civilian targets isn't always clear. The airmen were targeting military and industrial sites, but bombs aren't perfectly accurate. The Japanese didn't care about nuance. They wanted revenge. The trial was a sham. The accused had no real defense. The outcome was predetermined. All 8 men were found guilty. They were sentenced to death. The American government learned about this through neutral Swiss channels in August 1942. There was outrage. These were prisoners of war. You can't just execute POWs for doing their duty. The Japanese were violating international law. But there was nothing America could do. The men were in Japanese custody. There was no way to rescue them. But then something strange happened. The Japanese commuted 5 of the death sentences to life in prison. Only 3 men would be executed: Lieutenant Hallmark, Lieutenant Farrow, and Sergeant Spatz. Why these 3? Nobody knows for sure. Maybe random selection. Maybe they were singled out for some arbitrary reason. The Japanese never explained. On October 15, 1942, 6 months after the raid, Hallmark, Farrow, and Spatz were taken to a cemetery outside Shanghai. They were tied to posts. A Japanese firing squad executed them. 3 American airmen murdered for doing their job in wartime. The 5 survivors were kept in brutal conditions. Solitary confinement, minimal food, no medical care. Torture. The Japanese wanted them to suffer. Corporal Maeda had been injured during capture and never received proper medical treatment. He grew weaker over the months. His health deteriorated. On December 1st, 1943, Maeda died of malnutrition and disease in his cell. He was 27 years old. So now 4 men remained out of the original 8 captured: Haidt, Barr, de Shazer, and Nielsen. They endured another 1.5 years of imprisonment under horrific conditions. They were kept in complete isolation. No contact with each other or anyone else. No books. No entertainment. Nothing but 4 walls and their own thoughts. It drove them to the edge of sanity. Some days they weren't sure if they were still alive, or if this was some kind of afterlife punishment. They survived because they were stubborn, because they refused to give the Japanese the satisfaction of breaking them. They survived until August 1945, when Japan surrendered and Allied forces liberated POW camps across Asia. The 4 surviving Doolittle Raiders were found in a prison camp in China. They were emaciated, sick, traumatized, but alive. They'd survived 40 months of captivity. 40 months of wondering if they'd ever go home. 40 months of thinking about their executed friends. 40 months that damaged them in ways they'd never fully recover from. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Let's go back to April 1942 and the immediate aftermath of the raid. While 8 men were being captured and 80 others were being helped by Chinese civilians, the world was reacting to the news that Tokyo had been bombed. The Japanese public was shocked. Their government had told them they were safe, that American forces were defeated and retreating, that the war was going well. And then bombs fell on their capital in the middle of the day. Air raid sirens, explosions, chaos. Their government had lied. They weren't safe at all. The Japanese military was humiliated. How did American bombers reach Tokyo? Where did they come from? At first, they couldn't figure it out. Some thought the bombers came from China. Others suspected they came from aircraft carriers, but that seemed impossible. B-25s were too big for carriers. Japanese military doctrine said it couldn't be done. So they convinced themselves the bombers must have come from Chinese airfields. This belief would have terrible consequences for the Chinese people. The Japanese military launched a massive operation across eastern China to destroy any airfields that might have supported the American raid. They also wanted to punish the Chinese for helping the American airmen escape. What followed was one of the forgotten atrocities of World War II. The Zhejiang-Jiangxi campaign. Japanese forces swept through the provinces where the Doolittle Raiders had landed. They destroyed airfields. They burned villages. They massacred civilians, men, women, children. The Japanese killed anyone suspected of helping Americans. They killed anyone who lived near where Americans had landed. They killed to send a message. The estimates vary, but historians believe the Japanese killed approximately 250,000 Chinese civilians in retaliation for the Doolittle Raid. 250,000 people murdered because they lived in the wrong place. Because some of them helped American airmen. Because the Japanese were so enraged by being bombed that they took their anger out on defenseless villagers. It was collective punishment on a massive scale. And most Americans never knew about it. The heroic story of the Doolittle Raid doesn't usually mention that 250,000 Chinese civilians died because of it. This raises uncomfortable questions. Was the raid worth it? The physical damage to Japan was minimal. A few buildings destroyed, about 50 Japanese killed. The military impact was negligible, but the cost was enormous. 3 American airmen executed. 1 died in captivity. 250,000 Chinese civilians massacred. Was bombing Tokyo worth that price? There's no easy answer. The raid boosted American morale when it desperately needed boosting. It proved Japan was vulnerable. It forced the Japanese to keep fighter squadrons home for defense instead of sending them to the front lines. These were real strategic benefits, but they came at a terrible cost, paid mostly by people who had nothing to do with the raid. Meanwhile, back in America, the Doolittle Raid was being celebrated as a great victory. President Roosevelt was asked where the bombers came from. He joked they came from Shangri-La, the fictional paradise from the novel Lost Horizon. This became the official story. The bombers came from Shangri-La. The truth about the carrier launch remained classified. The Japanese couldn't know because if they figured out the tactic, they'd be watching for it. The American public didn't need to know operational details, so the mission became shrouded in mystery and heroic mythology. Doolittle and his surviving crews slowly made their way back to America with Chinese help. It took weeks for some. They walked through mountainous terrain. They hitched rides on whatever transportation they could find. They hid from Japanese patrols. The Chinese resistance moved them from safe house to safe house, always one step ahead of the Japanese. Eventually, they reached areas controlled by Chinese nationalist forces or American bases. From there, they were evacuated back to the United States. Doolittle was convinced he'd be court-martialed. He'd lost all 16 aircraft. Men were missing or captured. The mission had been a tactical disaster in his view. He wrote a report expecting to be punished. Instead, he was promoted. President Roosevelt awarded him the Medal of Honor. He skipped 2 ranks from lieutenant colonel to brigadier general. The other crew members received Distinguished Flying Crosses. They were heroes. The American public desperately needed heroes in early 1942 when the war was going badly. The Doolittle Raiders gave them that. But Doolittle felt guilty. 3 men executed, 1 dead in captivity. And he'd later learn about the Chinese civilians massacred. He carried that weight for the rest of his life. Yes, the raid was a success in terms of morale and strategy, but people died. Lots of people. And Doolittle never forgot that. The strategic impact of the raid was significant beyond just morale. The Japanese military was forced to reassess their defensive strategy. If American carriers could get close enough to launch bombers, Tokyo was vulnerable. They needed to push their defensive perimeter farther out. They needed to control more territory to keep American carriers at a distance. This thinking contributed to the Japanese decision to attack Midway Island in June 1942. They wanted to draw out and destroy American aircraft carriers. The Battle of Midway became the turning point of the Pacific War. The Japanese lost 4 carriers and never recovered. That battle happened partly because the Japanese were reacting to the Doolittle Raid. So in a roundabout way, the raid contributed to Japan's decisive defeat at Midway. The raid also forced Japan to keep fighter squadrons home for defense. These planes and pilots could have been used in the South Pacific, where fighting was intense. Instead, they stayed in Japan, protecting against future raids. This weakened Japanese forces elsewhere. The strategic impact wasn't about the physical damage from the bombs. It was about forcing Japan to change their dispositions and make decisions based on fear of future attacks. For the survivors, life after the raid was complicated. Some became career military officers. Some left the service and returned to civilian life. All of them were marked by the experience. They'd done something extraordinary, something that seemed impossible. They'd bombed Tokyo when everyone said it couldn't be done. That defined them for the rest of their lives. At reunions, they'd tell stories. They'd remember friends who didn't make it. They'd toast the executed and the one who died in captivity. They'd think about the Chinese people who helped them and the Chinese civilians who were massacred. The 4 who survived Japanese captivity had the hardest time. Jacob DeShauser, Chase Nielsen, Robert Hite, and George Barr came home damaged. The torture and isolation left psychological scars. DeShauser found religion during his captivity and became a missionary after the war. He actually went back to Japan to preach. He forgave his captors and dedicated his life to peace. It's remarkable considering what he endured. The others struggled more. Barr suffered health problems for the rest of his life from malnutrition and mistreatment. Nielsen dealt with PTSD before that term existed. Hite managed to build a successful career, but the memories never left him. The executed men were eventually honored. In 1946, their remains were recovered and returned to the United States. They were buried with full military honors. The Japanese officers responsible for their execution were tried as war criminals after the war. Some were executed themselves. Others received prison sentences. Justice of a sort, though it couldn't bring back the dead. The Chinese victims of the Japanese retaliation were never officially commemorated. There's no memorial, no list of names, just estimates from historians of how many died. 250,000 anonymous victims of a raid they had nothing to do with, except that they lived in the wrong place at the wrong time. Their deaths are a footnote in the story of the Doolittle Raid. Which seems wrong. They paid the highest price. The Doolittle Raiders became a fraternity. Every year they'd hold reunions. As they got older and their numbers dwindled, the reunions became more poignant. They'd established a tradition. There were 80 silver goblets, 1 for each man on the raid. The goblets were engraved with names. At each reunion, they'd do a roll call. When a name was called, and the man was still alive, someone would say, "Present." When a name was called and the man had died since the last reunion, someone would turn his goblet upside down. It was a way of honoring the dead and acknowledging that time was taking them one by one. The Doolittle Raiders became a fraternity. Every year they'd hold reunions. As they got older and their numbers dwindled, the reunions became more poignant. They'd established a tradition. There were 80 silver goblets, 1 for each man on the raid. The goblets were engraved with names. At each reunion, they'd do a roll call. When a name was called and the man was still alive, someone would say, "Present." When a name was called and the man had died since the last reunion, someone would turn his goblet upside down. It was a way of honoring the dead and acknowledging that time was taking them one by one. They also had a bottle of 1896 cognac. The plan was that when only 2 raiders remained alive, they'd open the bottle and toast their fallen comrades. It was morbid, but also beautiful. A final acknowledgement that they'd been part of something extraordinary, and they were the last witnesses to it. The bottle sat in a special case with the goblets, waiting for the day when there were only 2 left. By 2013, only 4 raiders were still alive. In November of that year, they held their final official reunion in Fort Walton Beach, Florida. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Staff Sergeant David Thatcher, Staff Sergeant Edward Saylor, and Lieutenant Colonel Robert Hite. 4 old men, all in their 90s, the last survivors of the 80 who flew the mission. They decided not to wait until only 2 remained. They opened the bottle. They toasted their 76 fallen comrades. It was emotional. These men who'd been young and fearless in 1942 were now at the end of their lives. They'd outlived almost everyone who shared their experience. And soon, there would be nobody left who remembered what it was like to take off from the Hornet and bomb Tokyo. Edward Saylor died in 2015. Robert Hite died in 2015. David Thatcher died in 2016. That left Richard Cole as the last Doolittle Raider. He was Doolittle's co-pilot on the lead plane. He'd been there for the impossible takeoff. He'd helped bomb Tokyo. He'd bailed out over China and survived. And now he was the only one left. He carried the memory of all 80 men. He did interviews. He spoke at schools. He made sure people remembered the raid and what it meant. Richard Cole died on April 9th, 2019, at the age of 103. With his death, the last living connection to the Doolittle Raid was gone. Now it's just history, stories and records and photographs. No living witnesses remain. The legacy of the Doolittle Raid is complicated. From a military perspective, it was a brilliant psychological operation with strategic benefits. It proved that innovation and courage could accomplish what conventional wisdom said was impossible. It forced Japan to make defensive decisions that weakened them elsewhere. It contributed to their defeat at Midway. It showed that American forces could strike back even in the darkest days of the war. From a human perspective, it was a tragedy. 80 men risked their lives. 4 died as direct result of the mission. 3 executed, 1 dying in captivity. 4 more spent 40 months as POWs under brutal conditions, and 250,000 Chinese civilians were massacred in retaliation. The cost in human suffering was enormous. Was the morale boost worth it? Was forcing Japan to keep fighters home for defense worth it? These are questions without clear answers. What's certain is that the men who flew the mission were incredibly brave. They volunteered for something they knew might kill them. They trained for months to do something that had never been done. They succeeded against all odds. Then most of them survived an impossible situation of crash landing in enemy territory and evading capture. That took skill, luck, and help from Chinese people who risked their own lives to save them. Doolittle himself always had mixed feelings. He was proud of what they accomplished, but he never forgot the men who died. He visited the families of the executed raiders. He stayed in touch with the survivors of Japanese captivity. He wrote about the Chinese civilians who were killed. He never tried to sugarcoat the cost. He was a hero who understood that heroism comes with a price, often paid by others. The raid also highlighted something important about warfare. Morale matters. Symbols matter. In April 1942, America needed a win. Needed proof that Japan wasn't invincible. Needed something to point to and say, "We can fight back." The Doolittle Raid provided that. It didn't win the war. It barely damaged Japan's military capability. But it changed the psychology of the war. Americans felt hope. Japanese felt fear. Those psychological shifts had real strategic consequences. The innovation of launching army bombers from a carrier demonstrated American willingness to try unconventional tactics. The Japanese military was often rigid and doctrinaire. They did things by the book. The Americans were more willing to experiment, to try something crazy and see if it worked. This flexibility gave America an advantage throughout the war. The Doolittle Raid was an early example of that American characteristic, willing to attempt the impossible rather than accept what conventional wisdom says can't be done. The Chinese people who helped the raiders deserved more recognition than they received. They saved most of the 80 Americans. They guided them to safety. They hid them from Japanese patrols. They risked execution to help strangers. And then they suffered terribly when the Japanese retaliated. The American government gave some official recognition after the war. Some Chinese helpers received medals and awards, but it was never enough. Nothing could be enough given what happened to the 250,000 civilians. There's a memorial in China now, at the Zhejiang province site where several raiders landed. It honors both the American airmen and the Chinese civilians who helped them. It acknowledges the massacres that followed. It's a complicated memorial because it has to hold both the heroism and the tragedy. The Chinese haven't forgotten. Local histories still talk about the Americans who fell from the sky and the terrible price Chinese people paid for helping them. In America, the Doolittle Raid is remembered mostly as a heroic story. There are books, documentaries, movies. The 1944 film 30 Seconds Over Tokyo, starring Spencer Tracy, told a dramatized version. The 2001 film Pearl Harbor included a lengthy Doolittle Raid sequence. These portrayals emphasize the bravery and the impossible mission. They usually downplay or omit the Chinese civilian deaths. American audiences want hero stories, not complicated narratives about unintended consequences. But the complicated narrative is the real story. Yes, the raiders were brave. Yes, the mission was extraordinary. But it also caused immense suffering. Both things can be true. History isn't simple. The Doolittle Raid was both a triumph and a tragedy. Celebrating the triumph doesn't mean ignoring the tragedy. Acknowledging the tragedy doesn't diminish the bravery of the men who flew the mission. The technological achievement shouldn't be forgotten either. Launching B-25s from a carrier was genuinely groundbreaking. It had never been done before. Many experts said it was impossible. The engineers who modified the planes, the pilots who trained for short field takeoffs, the carrier crew who figured out how to position 16 large bombers on a deck designed for smaller planes, all of them solved problems that had no existing solutions. They innovated under pressure. They made the impossible possible through careful planning, extensive practice, and sheer determination. The navigation challenges were immense, too. The crews flew to Japan using dead reckoning and landmarks. No GPS, no satellite navigation, just compasses, maps, and calculations. Then they flew to China in the dark, in a storm, with no radio navigation aids, running on fumes. Most of them found China. That's remarkable given the technology available. Modern pilots with modern navigation systems might struggle to replicate what the Doolittle Raiders did with 1942 technology. The fact that 69 of the 80 men survived is almost miraculous. 8 were captured, 4 of whom survived the war. 1 crew went to the Soviet Union and survived. That leaves 71 men who bailed out or crash-landed in China and managed to evade capture and return home. They did this with help from Chinese civilians and resistance fighters, but they also had to navigate, avoid Japanese patrols, communicate across language barriers, and survive in unfamiliar territory. The survival skills and luck required were extraordinary. Some of the individual survival stories are incredible. Sergeant Jacob de Chaza, one of the men captured and tortured, eventually received a Bible from his captors. He read it during his imprisonment and converted to Christianity. After the war, he became a missionary and returned to Japan, the country that had tortured him, to spread a message of peace and forgiveness. He spent 30 years in Japan. He met one of his former guards and forgave him. That level of forgiveness and personal transformation is remarkable. De Chaza turned his suffering into something meaningful. He chose peace over bitterness. Lieutenant Colonel Richard Cole, Doolittle's co-pilot and the last survivor, spent his final years ensuring the story wasn't forgotten. He did countless interviews. He spoke at museums and military events. He shared his memories with historians. He knew that once he was gone, there would be no more first-hand accounts. So he made sure the story was preserved in as much detail as possible. Cole was 23 years old on the day of the raid. He lived another 77 years carrying those memories. That's a long time to be defined by one day, even a day as extraordinary as April 18th, 1942. The goblets and the cognac bottle are now in the National Museum of the U.S. Air Force in Dayton, Ohio. They're displayed with all 80 goblets turned upside down. The empty cognac bottle sits in its case. It's a powerful memorial. 80 silver goblets representing 80 men who did something impossible. All upside down now, because all the men are gone. But the goblets remain as permanent witnesses to what happened on that day. Doolittle himself went on to have a distinguished military career. He commanded the 12th Air Force in North Africa, then the 15th Air Force in the Mediterranean, then the 8th Air Force in Europe. He retired as a lieutenant general. He received numerous awards and honors. He died in 1993 at age 96. But he always said the Doolittle Raid was the defining moment of his life. Everything else that came after, all the promotions and awards and responsibilities, flowed from that one mission when he led 79 other men on an impossible attack against the Japanese homeland. The question of whether the raid was worth it depends on perspective. From a purely military standpoint, the direct damage was minimal, but the indirect strategic benefits were significant. From a morale perspective, it was invaluable to American public opinion. From a humanitarian perspective, the cost in Chinese civilian lives was catastrophic. All of these perspectives are valid. History isn't about finding simple answers. It's about understanding complexity and acknowledging that actions have multiple consequences, some intended and some not. What we can say with certainty is this. On April 18, 1942, 80 American airmen did something that military experts said couldn't be done. They launched medium bombers from an aircraft carrier. They bombed Tokyo and other Japanese cities. They proved that Japan's homeland was vulnerable. Most of them survived against incredible odds. The mission changed the psychology of the Pacific War. It forced Japan to make strategic decisions that ultimately weakened them. And it cost lives, American and Chinese, that should never be forgotten. The Doolittle Raid was both inspiring and tragic, both successful and costly, both a triumph of human courage and a reminder of war's terrible price. That's what makes it such an important story. It's not a simple tale of heroism. It's a complex narrative about what humans are capable of, the extraordinary bravery and the devastating consequences. Both sides of that story deserve to be told. Both sides deserve to be remembered. 80 men flew on the Doolittle Raid. 4 died because of it. 76 came home. All of them were changed by the experience. All of them carried it for the rest of their lives. And now all of them are gone, leaving behind a story that's both inspiring and heartbreaking. A story of the impossible mission that changed the war, saved morale, and cost far more than anyone expected. That's the real story of the Doolittle Raid. Not just the heroic takeoff and the daring bombing run, but everything that came after. The survival, the capture, the execution, the massacre, the long lives lived in the shadow of one extraordinary day. Remember their names, all 80 of them. Remember what they did and what it cost. Remember that heroism and tragedy often exist together. Remember that war has consequences far beyond the battlefield. Remember the Doolittle Raiders. If this incredible true story moved you, subscribe for more forgotten history that deserves to be remembered.